I want to welcome everyone today to our SILS Connections event, a new virtual alumni engagement programming series that we're starting for 2020. My name is Lori Haight, and I serve as the Career Services Coordinator at SILS. And today I'd like to turn it over to Samira Creel, who will launch into what her talk is going to be about today. So thank you very much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm always excited to come back to Carolina in some way or another. I've been part of trying to help SILS through their diversity alumni network for a little while. And when I was with Capital One, I came down often for the tech development program. So really just trying to recruit good folks out of Carolina. So I'm happy for the opportunity to come back and help in any way I can. In case I don't say it at the end, or if I forget, after this, please feel free to reach out to Lori for my contact information. I'm happy to continue conversations and help really in any way that I can right now. So thanks for having me today. I'm excited to be here. When Lori reached out kind of through email, she had asked a little bit about kind of user experience and things like that. And as I thought about what I wanted to share, I thought about kind of just my general career path. And why I went to Carolina and how I got into experience and products. And I didn't intend to be here. I got to be honest, right? If I think back from the very beginning of just kind of, high school, right? When I thought about what I wanted to be when I grew up, and where I wanted to end up and what I wanted to do. Like, I think the one thing I knew I always wanted to do is I wanted to make a difference somehow. And I wanted to leave my mark on something. And I knew I wanted to sort of climb the proverbial career chain in some way. But I wasn't 100% sure where or how. My father was pretty kind of one of those, when people ask you like, who are your mentors, who are your heroes, things like that. It was my dad. My dad had a PhD in statistics. And so he was very math oriented. He worked for the World Bank here in the United States, which is what brought us here. But originally we're actually from Tanzania. And while we were in Tanzania, he started off as a professor there, but then ended up working for the president. And so he was part of the president's cabinet. So he didn't have a political affiliation. It was purely off of the econometrics value that he added. So I had some pretty big footsteps to follow in. And so I knew I wanted to somehow kind of make a difference. Math and science were really sort of my only options growing up, right? My parents were like, oh, it's great that you like to read. It's great that you like to, write and dabble here and there, but their big things were, you want us to pay for college, you get math or science. It's kind of your only two options. So I will say, as a tangent, a lot of people ask me to speak to about kind of being a woman in tech. And it's one of those things where I resisted it for a very long time, because in my mind, the perception of being a woman in technology is that you had to overcome some extreme barrier to get there, right? And that you struggled against the odds to be in a technical field. And for me, I was like, pretty sure I was handed it on a silver platter, right? By virtue of the skill sets I was pushed towards. My family is Muslim. And so, traditionally too, it was the whole, arranged marriages and like all that stuff. But that's something that my parents were very much like opposed to. They were like, you get your degrees, you stand on your own 2 feet, you do what you want in math or science, and the rest will come by itself. So, I didn't have the kind of typical barriers to it. And so, but what I did realize, I will say, is as you look at being in the technology field, what women do suffer from is kind of hitting a ceiling and then feeling like you can't compete to get kind of those legs up. And so, that's just one of those things that over time as well is kind of very interesting to sort of like think about, and we could certainly touch on. But for me, it was really, okay, I needed math or science. And I actually started out at Rochester Institute of Technology to do environmental engineering is what I kind of went to do. And pretty quickly, I learned that I did not want to chain myself to a tree to save it. So I'll say that the program there was a little too granola for me. And even though it was an engineering discipline, I very quickly learned it wasn't what I wanted to do. So I swung over to industrial engineering. And what I learned there was that my personality didn't necessarily fit in with the rest of the engineers. So I definitely was one of the fewer females in industrial engineering. However, I was also a cheerleader, and my cheer schedule conflicted with some of the study groups and things like that. And at the end of the day, right, like back in, gosh, I'm going to date myself now, but like back in, 99, 90, 95, 96, right, it was one of those things where it's like, that was not necessarily okay to be, right? Being kind of the well-rounded female in engineering wasn't really a thing. So I was like, well, okay, maybe the discipline isn't necessarily for me. I left and moved back to Virginia from New York, and decided to transfer to George Mason University. And when I first started, I started off in business because I thought to myself, maybe I could do marketing, because it seems like if people, if I can get my little brother to do chores he doesn't want to do around the house, surely I can get millions of people to buy things they don't want, right? That was sort of in my head what marketing was all about and where I thought that I could do the most good quickly. So I signed it, I got into their marketing program, and again, pretty quickly learned like, this isn't quite for me. I was a little bit bored, and not because it's not difficult, but just because it wasn't anything I was passionate about. And by happenstance, I took an MIS class trying to figure out kind of where to go with it. And that's really where I found kind of my sweet spot. So it was kind of, again, right, it was kind of accidental. It was one of those, signed up for something too late. It was one of the only elective classes left. I needed it because while my parents were very much like, hey, you transferred, if you need an extra year to complete your undergrad, it's okay. To me, I kind of looked at that as, hey, if I don't finish in 4 years, I will somehow be a failure, right? Is kind of what I was thinking to myself. And so I was like, no, I want to do it. I'm going to load myself up with classes and get through the regular schedule. And so I took the class and loved it because it was all about puzzle pieces to me and how to create efficiencies. And it was a little bit of business that you really had to know, and then a lot about sort of data and information and kind of how to utilize that in the best way possible. And so George Mason actually had a dual major that I ended up switching to, which was management information systems and decision sciences, which is really applied statistics. When you think about it, I think different schools have a slightly different opinion of what decision sciences is, but at the end of the day, it's applied statistics, how to optimize things, and all that good stuff. So I kind of went there without really knowing what career I wanted to go into. I had this degree in mind, and lo and behold, senior year came along and people started applying for jobs, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but Mason had a great career development program, and they set up interviews and things like that. And Capital One happened to be one of the folks there. And I never thought that I would be working at a bank with what I was doing. And I used Capital One as kind of like just practice, honestly. Interestingly enough, Capital One's interview process is actually quite difficult. There's a lot of hoops to jump through. There's online testing. There's in-person testing, there are case studies, and then there are behavioral interviews. So you're run through your paces pretty hard. And it was an interesting, very eye-opening kind of interview process for me. I was pleasantly surprised to get a job offer from them about the same time that I got a job offer from a consulting firm. And I'll be honest, I picked Capital One because it would allow me to move out of the house. So when I went back to Mason, I moved back home and was like, well, this is not great, because I feel like I'm in high school. I had pretty strict parents, right? So I didn't have your typical undergrad experience. I didn't get to go to the parties. I didn't get to kind of have the on-campus experience. I lived at home. I commuted. I took these classes. I was really just trying to get out without knowing what I wanted to do. So I moved to Richmond, Virginia, much to my parents' dismay. Although I lived in Northern Virginia, I was an hour and a half away from home. Really wasn't that far away. But I moved out. I moved down to Richmond. the first role I had was in a team called Systems Control and Testing. So it was very much about really, testing systems, and not a whole lot to do with anything I studied in school. And about, 6 to 8 months in, I kind of got bored with what I was doing and started looking for other opportunities. And I will say one of the great things about Capital One, and I've been there twice in my career, is that there's always an opportunity somewhere. And if you network well, you can be given those opportunities pretty quickly. So I started chatting with people, looking for side projects, and quickly moved over to their metrics team to do metrics analysis, kind of like performance analysis within their systems. And then I sort of had the thought about, kind of the nagging thought about going to grad school. And because at the time, I also thought to myself, well, the best way to sort of, all the leaders that I saw around me had multiple degrees. Most of them had MBAs. And I will say that when I talked, when I sought advice from my dad, his big thing was like, look, if you want to be solely in business, an MBA may be worth it. But if you're trying to get depth of knowledge in a field, you might want to consider an MS degree. And so he actually did a lot of research to kind of help me out. And kind of we came down to Carolina and then kind of a school up in Illinois where we were looking for that had this MSIS degree. But he did kind of push me a little to say, well, what do you want to do when your degree is done, right? Do you want to teach? So do you need a PhD? Or are you kind of good with your master's degree? And where is it going to take you? Where are you going to go with it? And at the time, I thought I was locked in on what I wanted to do, having kind of watched my dad's career and seen what he had done with the World Bank as part of the United Nations. I was very bent on going to Carolina and then applying to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Geneva. Because I also have a minor in French. So I was like, I can use my French degree. I can use some of the statistics stuff. I can help like world issues. It seemed pretty kind of lofty at the time, but that's what I wanted to do. And I still remember the very first class I was in at Carolina when they kind of went around and were like, why are you here? What do you want to do? And I put threw that out there and we're like, okay, like that's pretty specific, but is what it is. So I kind of had that in the back of my mind. I was very fortunate to be able to be a full-time student at Carolina and to sort of do kind of the odd job. I actually worked for I don't know what's called now, but it's like the group that goes around and does all the like long distance learning classes at the time where you would kind of come in, like the AV teams there. I was the Carolina Computing Initiative girl for a little while. I was the one who convinced undergrads why they had to buy a certain computer when they joined Carolina. Which is when I learned that actors have a big job, right? It's not as easy as it looks. Just memorizing scripts isn't enough. But I will say, right, Carolina is really where I got to explore, and the teachers there really challenged me. One in particular, it was a class I will never forget on metadata. And that's kind of where I first sort of got this foray into the importance of it and just kind of what it does for you. The other classes that I took there that really sort of started changing or challenging the way that I had thought were the research classes, specifically those about qualitative data, right? Because I will say, growing up in a household which was very statistics heavy, I really thought that quantitative data was king, and that was the only way to get anything done. Data-driven decisions were all about the numbers, and that was it. But at Carolina, I sort of learned and was challenged on that multiple times in multiple ways, right? And it was very, very eye-opening. Kind of towards the end, life kind of happened. I ended up applying for the job with the International Atomic Energy Agency, but I also met a boy and decided to stick around the U.S. And I stayed in North Carolina to work for the Padea Center in Chapel Hill. And about 3 or 4 months into that, I realized I just wasn't happy. And Accenture had reached out to me, which is a local consulting firm, kind of IT consulting firm, and asked sort of if I would interview for them. And I did. I interviewed with Accenture and I ended up moving to Northern Virginia. and got into consulting. And I'll say, right, nothing that I did right away had anything to do with anything that I learned at Carolina. It was all about relational databases for the government. And so it kind of took me back to my undergrad. And I'll say, right, I kind of looked at it as a failure of sorts. So I know like the topic of the discussion is kind of what I deem kind of the rules of failing forward. And I'll kind of circle back on that at the end. But to me, in that moment, even though I was working for, one of the big 5 consulting firms, and a lot of people were like, wow, you're lucky, that's a great place to be working, I thought I was a failure because I didn't do what I had set out to do. And I wasn't using anything that I learned at Carolina. I just sort of had felt like I had shelved it. I had this great degree from this great university, but other than opening a couple doors, I wasn't sure what else it gave me. And so I kind of went through the paces at Accenture. I moved to Richmond, Virginia through Accenture. They had a big project down here, and I was here every week. It just made sense, especially given Northern Virginia is so pricey, right? It's very expensive to live up there. Richmond is a way lower cost of living. So I moved to Richmond. And interestingly enough, as soon as I moved here, they put me on another project out in California, and I wasn't going to move to California. So I left. I left Accenture and ended up going to Genworth Financial. And I had a friend there, which I will say, I think it's part of that, the power of networks, right? Is like the people that sometimes can help you open doors to try new things. And I went there to be a technical project manager because they were really looking for someone at the time who had a technical background, could understand things, but was very kind of data driven and kind of very detail oriented. So ended up going to Genworth. Didn't really like it, right? I feel like over the course of my career, I've learned that managing projects and project management are 2 very different things. Over the course of the last kind of 6 years, I've definitely had multiple teams and multiple projects to manage. But it's very different than actually being a project manager. And so it was something that I didn't necessarily like. I didn't want to do. I ended up kind of swinging over, kind of staying in the insurance field, but going to Markel, where I was a platform lead. And so this was kind of the first opportunity I had to maybe start using some of the stuff I learned at Carolina as far as kind of the whole qualitative data is concerned, and even metadata, because I was a platform lead. And it was one of those things where I was accountable for the integrity of the platform. So anybody who requested changes to the system had to come through me. So I didn't have to code. I wasn't a hands-on like keyboard coder, but I had to know enough about how everything was connected in the back end to know kind of the downstream and upstream impacts. And that's really where, it's funny, I think as I think about how I got into user experience, I think I was in it before it was kind of became a coined term of what it was. And because really I had found myself in a situation where I inherited a system that a consulting team had left for us. And it was a system that was utilized by a financial team and a marketing team. And they were using the data very differently. And so that was at the time where I was like, look, I get that as IT, traditionally we work with this customer and then we work with this customer and they don't talk to each other. We make the decisions. And I finally was like, I kind of want to try something different. I want to bring them to the table. I want to put tape over the mouth of the IT people because I don't want to figure out how to do it. I want to figure out what's the problem we're solving and for whom and how. So it was really kind of the first attempt at kind of bringing everyone together and saying, what is your objective, right? Like, what is the business objective that you were trying to accomplish with this system? And really trying to understand kind of how they felt about things, like what was it they were doing in their day-to-day. And again, right then it was just called business requirements gathering. Then it was just sort of solutions engineering. It wasn't user experience. But when I stop now and look back on it, that's exactly what we were doing, right? We were trying to understand how hands on the keyboard were using the system in order to make it more efficient. But Markel, just for various reasons, right? It was one of those things where it was a great company. There was a changing of the guard. And at the time I was like, you know what? I think maybe it's time to go back to Capital One. So I went back to Capital One, and I actually went back to be a platform lead there. And if you know anything about Capital One, whether you read about it in the news or not, they do a lot of layoffs and they do a lot of org changes. A lot of the org changes happen completely randomly, and one day you're one role and the next day you're another, and it may or may not make any sense to you. So I went in there to be a platform lead, and 2 weeks later I was a scrum master. I had never been a scrum master before. Like, I had heard of Agile, I knew about Agile. I didn't know what it meant to be a scrum master. So I got trained. I got training, and I got a couple teams underneath me. Now I will say this, at Capital One at the time, being a scrum master meant your solutioning hat got taken off. You were literally just facilitating. And I didn't like it. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to be in that role. And honestly, my performance tanked because I wasn't motivated. And at the year end, my performance rating went from, like a 4 down to like a 2, which is not good, right? So again, in my mind, here's another failure, right? I've got all these degrees, I have all this great experience, and I'm coming out with a bad performance rating. And it's not because I'm not good at what I do, it's that I wasn't motivated for the role I was in. So I had, I will say the other thing that I will encourage all of you, right, whether you're still in school or whether you're a working professional, the power of having both mentors and sponsors. And they're very different, right? Your mentor is definitely someone who's there to coach you and give you kind of guidance on how do you handle something, how they handle things when they were in their career. But having a sponsor is really important too. And your sponsor is somebody who is there, who knows the work quality you can produce, who truly believes in the work that you can do, and that are almost always looking for opportunities for you. So when they hear that, hey, this team is looking for this type of person, you're the first person on their mind, and they're going to stake their reputation on you in that role, regardless of any kind of past performance reviews and things like that. So I will say I was very fortunate to have some great mentors that introduced me to some great sponsors. So I had some good sponsors in the company. And so was very quickly kind of put up for a different role in a different space to kind of do, interestingly enough, some metadata work. So I was excited. I was like, here's an opportunity to get back to that whole metadata thing. And I swung back over to kind of more hardcore tech. And of course, just through kind of political things, some of those projects were put on hold. And that's when this whole concept of design thinking and user experience actually kind of fell into my lap, because one of the projects that I was asked to work on was to take the yearly innovation competitions winner and actually put it into production that year. So our CIO, Rob Alexander, had promised the winning team's app would be in production. So it was around January, February of the year. They gave me the project. And what it was an app to help with recruiting. And it sounded like a pretty good app, right? It was helping with college recruiting. So it was all about, you could check your application from your phone. You could talk to recruiters on your phone. You could do a lot of really cool stuff from your phone. And in theory, it sounded like a pretty good application for everybody. And so my boss at the time was like, hey, do you know design thinking? Do you know about user experience? We really need to use this to get this through the life cycle and get it in quickly. And I was like, no clue. So got sent to another set of training classes, right? And I felt like, I was like, gosh, I'm just constantly like in training classes. Like, is anything that I learned in school going to be valuable, or do I have to constantly learn new things? And I will say now, as I reflect, it's always a combination, right? You're constantly learning. I'm still learning. And so I went through it. And as I was going through the design thinking training class, really design thinking is a tool that's utilized in user experience, but it's standalone, right? It's not a UX tool only. It's really a problem-solving methodology. And it can be used in any fields. And so that was kind of one of the interesting things. And when you think about sort of the principles of design thinking, the first one is discovery. So it's all about the research and all about empathetic research, right? So this is kind of where it connects me back to like my Carolina days, where I was like, oh, wait a minute. That qualitative research stuff that they kept trying to shove down our throats actually is a thing. And so it's all about the importance of discovery to understand, whether or not you're solving the right problem at the right time. And so you'll hear in UX this concept of like the double diamond. And the first diamond is all about discovery and design thinking. And the second diamond is all about implementation, which sometimes people forget, right? Implementation and then kind of metrics, measuring it and recycling through is that second part of the diamond, which is so important. And the first part is, are we solving the right problem? The second diamond is, are we solving it? Are we implementing it the right way, right? Are we doing it the right way? But the first part is, are we looking at the thing that's really causing pain to our user base, to our customers, to our clients? And so it was very interesting because I'll tell you this, right? To make a long story short, we didn't get that app into production. And I had to be the one to go to the CIO and say, hey, remember that the application you wanted us to put in production by October? Yeah, it's not going to happen. And I kind of came to him with the data, right? We ran it through its paces. I actually remember coming to Chapel Hill to run some experience tests there. I sat in the pit and I had a whole bunch of cards to the student store. Like there were $50 gift cards. And I'm like, for 5 minutes of your time, I'll give you $50 student gift card. And kind of showing them the app and having them just kind of run through it, right? And we had a prototype there that we were kind of running through its paces. I had given easily, between the people that I met, the people that were interviewing with Capital One, like various methods, we gave about 1,000 Carolina students the opportunity to download the app and give us feedback. 5 people downloaded the app, right? And it was one of those things where part of it was, well, why, right? And when I went to Carolina and grabbed people, I got a wealth of information that I wouldn't have known. And that really was sort of that piece that taught you, like, you are not a user the moment you start developing something, right? Because the team that was putting this app together were college grads, right? The new college grads that were at Capital One. And they're like, I mean, we used to be those people 6 months ago. We know what they want. We know what that app should look and feel like. But the minute you become the person designing an app for someone else, you are no longer the user of the app, right? And I hear it all the time. I hear people say, right, product managers at State Farm going, I don't need to go talk to actual users. I'm a State Farm user, like I have that stuff. But when you work for the company, you can no longer be the sole user, right? Like, yeah, you can do some of your alpha testing, but for real empathy, no way, right? You have to leave the building to go and talk to other people. I used to have a big sticker on my computer that said, you are not your user, right? No matter where you are and where you sit. So it was really very kind of eye-opening to me, the whole design thinking methodology, the whole, empathy, that whole qualitative analysis. And over the years, right, by the time I left and went to the Federal Reserve and I left Capital One, I'll be honest, I was just burnt out. Capital One, for as amazing a company as it is, the roles that I was in tech, I was just tired. I was traveling a lot with Capital One. I was teaching design thinking and facilitating these sessions. Because I'll tell you what, something that I learned at Carolina is kind of how to quantify qualitative data. And that is so important in user experience. It's all about, because whether you like it or not, the business people you talk to don't actually care all the time about their end users. They're worried about the money. And so you really need to figure out how to find a way to take all of the empathetic data you're getting and quantify it for them to say, I need this feature prioritized on a roadmap, and here's why, and here's what it's going to get you later, right? So, I think over the years too, the other thing I've heard, which always makes me laugh, is they're like, oh, you UX people, you just make things look pretty. And it's not, right? It's so much more than just making things look pretty. There really is a science behind it. It's not all creative and design. And I'll say in the beginning, I didn't think I could be in UX because I was like, well, I mean, I'm not creative. I have a hard enough time getting dressed in the morning and matching, right? My kids do a better job at that than I do. So I was like, I'm not creative. I don't match, things like that. But what I am good at is observing people and watching them and understanding what motivates them and really taking that qualitative data and quantifying it, because there are a lot of measures, even in UX, that shows you that it really is a science and it really takes an analytical mindset. It's not just about making things look pretty. User interface design absolutely is about that. But even in UI design, right, if you have a good UI designer, they're going to want to care about the experience behind it very much. and really think about what drives and motivates people and their behaviors. And that's really when you find, I will say another thing that people often say is, oh, you UX people are always using personas. And while personas are helpful, personas are the new kind of thing is really the jobs to be done framework, which is really about thinking about what job are you trying to accomplish by creating a new product, a new thing, right? And I think about something as simple as a newspaper, right? Why do people still sell newspapers when you can get everything digitally? And part of it is think about the job that paper is trying to fulfill, right? And I think about, my dad used to take the metro to work every day, and he would be bored and he would want to read something. And way back when, right, like your phone wasn't going to work underneath there. It was trying to prevent boredom. So when you think about, right, the job that newspaper is doing, it makes it easier to justify keeping it around than anything else. And that's a very simplistic example of it. But that jobs to be done framework, coupled with kind of all of that empathetic research, right? And that empathetic research is what's going to get you that jobs to be done framework, is so powerful in being able to prioritize and get, a product roadmap created of any sort. So when you think about it, right, it's all about that. Now, when I left Capital One, again, it was pure burnout. I had had my second child and I just needed a break. And I will say the Federal Reserve definitely is a swing. It's a hard swing in a different direction. It's got its own challenges, but it's definitely one of those things where I was like, yeah, no, I think I need a slower pace. The UX team that I led there was a brand new team. So they hadn't really done UX within national IT before. It was part of workforce technology. So it was all about making sure that the workforce had the right tools at the right time. And it was a strategy team. So if you think about the old plan, build, run model, the UX team sat in plan, and it was all about driving prioritization. So we created a voice of the customer program, which was all about, going out and interviewing users, understanding how they use the things that they use, what tools they needed. And what was interesting there is it was very eye-opening to me to have to be able to help folks in IT understand what true user experience was, as well as actually trying to make the connections for what they were trying to do and deliver for folks, right? So my team was not traditional. Wasn't a team of traditional designers. Capital One, I kind of moved from that first project I had to leading a strategy and design team, and it was UI, UX designers. At the Fed, it was a team of strategists. And so UX strategy is a whole other realm of UX, kind of the umbrella of experience. And what's cool about strategy is that it's really about the long term and how do we get there and how do we provide things that are going to be needed in the future. The bad part about UX strategy is you can't recognize the benefits of it overnight. It's usually about 1.5 to 2 years before you see the real value of your strategy. But when you think about business people who just spent hundreds and thousands of dollars on a brand new team, they want immediate results, right? They want to know that they see the value within the first quarter or second quarter. So it was definitely a challenge, and it was interesting. And I'll say the mistake I made there, looking back on it, was trying too quickly to prove it worked rather than to take the time to go around and educate people about what it is and what it is not. And I'm sure if any of you were on, Haight's talk earlier this week, or maybe it's later, I don't know, she's the Nielsen Norman group, which I'll tell you, I have no affiliation with Nielsen Norman other than I've gone through their training classes. I don't get any money for this. But when anybody asks me where they should go to learn about UX, I always send them to Nielsen Norman. They are the kings of data and research, especially for how to apply data and things like that. Like, you cannot find a better training course than Nielsen Norman. They are amazing. And more than just design thinking, like all of it, how to be a VP in UX, how to be, get into it, how to be the lone wolf in UX, all of it, right? All of it is great. But Nielsen Norman is really, really great for that. It was a struggle, and I wish that I had taken more time to actually kind of hit the pause button and help people understand. I will say that's really where I had to show a lot of that quantitative stuff. I went out, we went on these kind of what we called, these drop-in sessions where we would go to the different Federal Reserves and we would interview folks and we would unpack the data and we would share it. And I will say something that I learned along the way there too is the power of insight in UX. And it's very hard to write the right insight statement, and different perspectives will give you different insights on it. So two people will hear the same sentence and pull different interpretations of it, and neither of them are wrong, right? You really have to think about, well, which one is happening more often? So it's just a fascinating thing, and it kind of goes back to that whole concept of metadata. So when we were building out this voice of the user program, and we had quantitative data from surveys, but we also had this qualitative data, and it was all about adding that metadata and the right tagging system to it in order to pull the right empathy together in order to prove a point when we were trying to prioritize something or push it, right? So it's kind of the tie back to, oh, I'm finally using things that I learned when I was in college. It was a big tie. And I loved the Federal Reserve. I love what I did there. I will say the only reason I left is because I was recruited away by a company called OneWhy. I had a friend that I worked with at Capital One who had moved to OneWhy, which was a startup. And he'd kind of come after me, and he was like, hey, we're building a brand new customer experience team. You can do it from scratch. You'll be leading the operational side of the house, which is the support side, as well as building this brand new team. And one of the things that had always frustrated me about the Fed is that the operational team and all the data that lived there, which was all the transactional data, lived very separately from all of the behavioral data. So it was really hard to sort of cross-analyze it. Whereas if you have it underneath the same leader, you're setting the same objectives, you can kind of do it all the time. And so you've got your proactive and reactive all together. And so I was like, what an amazing opportunity, right? It would be a step up in my career. It would be more role and responsibility. It'd be working for a startup, which is a little bit scary. Right now, granted, they were a big startup. They were backed by SoftBank at the time and some other big names. And so I was like, it was a hard emotional decision to leave the Fed because I had a great team, right? I had an amazing team. I had a great boss. She was amazing. I knew that I was going to get a promotion at year end. And so it's like, I can either stay, get this promotion at year end, or I could leave in October and take this new role and in this unknown thing, right? And I sat there and I thought to myself, and I talked to my husband about it, and he's like, look, it's really up to you, right? Is it going to make you happy? Is it something you're passionate about doing? And I'm like, look, it's building a brand new team from scratch, which granted, I had done that at the Fed, but there was still other challenges there. And this was kind of having that operational kind of oversight as well. So I took the chance and I went. And literally 3 weeks after I started, they had a change in their business objectives and CX got deprioritized. And while I still had a job, all I was doing was leading support. So I had level 1, 2, 3. I was basically running the help desk, right? And so you think about, the career path I had been on and kind of getting ready. I was like, and I sat there and I was so angry at myself because I was like, the Fed is stable. The Fed is not going anywhere. I gave up a promotion to get into the officer realm at year end, which was guaranteed. I knew I was going to get it. I had a great team. I had a great boss. Like, I was the subject matter expert in my space. And now I kind of feel like an imposter because while I've definitely been in IT and I can lead people, I've never been on a help desk. I don't know how to run the day-to-day operations of a help desk. And I was furious at the friend who kind of convinced me to join him, right? Because he was now my boss. And I was like, feels like a very huge bait and switch. You can't tell me you didn't know this was coming, right? Business objectives don't change overnight. Like, you had to have known this was coming down the pipeline. Come to find out that he didn't actually understand what CX was in its relation to other things, right? That his CIO did. I interviewed with the CIO, but it was one of those things where it's like, there was kind of that mismatch. And so there was that. There was the fact that I was told I could be a remote leader because the company was up in Northern Virginia. And I was like, I don't really want to be on the road all the time. And so I went from not being on the road or being in a role that I was told you get to build a brand new CX, you get to take all this work, you get to work as a remote leader, and maybe only be up here a week, a month, which isn't bad, to now I was traveling to Palermo, Italy. I was traveling to London. I was traveling to DC. I was never in town, never. And so I very quickly started looking for a new job. And I interviewed again with Capital One. I interviewed at Markel, and I interviewed at CarMax. And I actually interviewed for product manager roles rather than user experience roles. And I think part of it, right, when people say like, well, it's a slightly different discipline, but you've never held the title product manager, what makes you think you can be a product manager? And it's really, if you think about user experience and you think about having a technical background and really being able to quantify qualitative data, that's what running products is all about, right? It's all about understanding your marketplace and your competitive advantage. It's about really advocating for your client, and it's about taking your product to the next level and thinking about the experiential strategy of it. I mean, when you kind of combine all of those things and think about discovery and research, like that's all about product. And to be a good product manager, a good product person, you have to know that you're never done, right? When you release it, you're not done. You're testing it, you're evaluating it, you're making it better. And if you don't have that mindset, you probably don't belong in product. But it's just one of those things where, right, I started looking, I had my heart set on a role at Markel. And they went with a different candidate, and, I totally understood why. And a day later, I had an interview with Capital One lined up to kind of go back to Capital One. And then I got a call from Riskbased Security, which is where I am now. And interestingly enough, right, and this is again where I talk about like the power of your network, right? I wasn't in touch for a long time with the CEO of Riskbased Security. His name is Jake Koons. And out of nowhere, right? And this is funny. It's funny because it's the Markel connection. Is I got the sorry, we went with another candidate call, and I cried. I did, right? I had my heart set on it. I was my way out. I was so sure I was going to get it. I cried. And then, a couple hours later, I get a random LinkedIn message from Jake. And Jake was like, hey, how are you liking OneWhy? Now, I'm going to tell you something. Like, while Jake and I we worked together at Markel. I was a brand new manager there. Like, it was my first leadership role. Brand new manager, probably one of the younger ones on the team. And Jake was already like a senior director at the time. So we already kind of knew the game and everything. And very quickly, he kind of took me under my wing at Markel and was like, this is how we don't play politics. This is how you deal with difficult people like me, because he was the head of the InfoSec. And I tell you, InfoSec is always a pain in everybody's neck, right? No matter where you are, especially when you're in UX and innovation, information security teams are the bane of your existence. And we are the bane of theirs. There's always that struggle, right? So that's how I knew Jake. And when I left Markel to go to Capital One, Jake and I connected on Facebook and LinkedIn. And I got invited to his annual like Halloween parties, but for whatever reason, I was never able to go. So Jake and I never, other than the occasional like, hey, how's it going? Or like on somebody's picture, we hadn't really talked. But he randomly reached out to me and was like, hey, how are things going at OneWhy? And he caught me, right? He caught me after I had gotten this bad news. And if he had caught me on another day, I might have responded in a more professional manner, but I didn't. I was like, well, how much time do you have, right? I was like, it was a beat and switch. I'm always on the road. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, by the way, if you know anybody hiring in Richmond, please save me, right? Completely unprofessional email. Because to me, I'm like, I'm talking to a friend. He's reaching out after 10 years. Let me tell him how I'm really feeling. And so he wrote back and he's like, well, actually, I know someone who's hiring. And I'm like, great, can you pass him my resume, right? And I sent him my like recent copy of my resume. And he wrote back, he's like, it's me, like I'm hiring. And I'm like, oh, oops, right? And then I sat there and reread what I wrote and was like, oh, well, that was bad. But he was like, why don't we chat when you're in town? And I was like, okay, I'll be back Friday. So I popped into his office and asked him, like, what is it you're looking for? And he's like, I need help in the product space. RBS has got a great product that we love. It's actually very data driven. So data is the majority of our product, and we're trying to take it to the next level. We need somebody who understands kind of how product runs. I need someone to sort of help wrangle development teams and things like that. I know, by the way, do you know anything about client success? And so I was just like, sure, right, here's a couple different thoughts. And really, I was just kind of talking to him in general, right? I didn't know what he wanted me there for. And originally he was like, I'd love to bring you on as a product manager. And I was just very honest with him, right? I was like, listen, while I'm trying to get back into products and specifically kind of UX for product, I really feel like I still want to be, I want to be more than just an individual contributor, right? And I'm interviewing with Capital One. I had my final round that week with them. I'm waiting to kind of hear back from them, and it would be kind of for a senior manager role to kind of like run a team and blah, blah, blah. Here are the things that I think I could bring to you. And then I thought about it and I pitched him, like I sent him a deck, right? I put together a 2 to 3 page PowerPoint, which was like, here's how I think, right? Whether it's me or someone else, let me help you, at least in the product space. And I kind of put together the things, it was kind of like a lessons learned, like kind of over the years, what I've learned about UX and product and the type of people you need and why your client success person can't be the same person as your product person, but it should be the same leader, because client success is proactive, just like product is. And there's so much empathy that's gained from it. Like the person setting the objectives in that org should be the same. And I said, I would love to join your company as maybe like a director level to kind of help in that product space, get it off the ground. Here are the principles I would use. Here are the things I've learned along the years. And then my goal, right, to show you longevity would be to be your VP in 5 years and eventually be your CPO, right, your chief product officer within 10. So there's my 10-year plan at RBS for you. And, I interviewed with the chairman of the board, told him something very similar, right? As far as like, here are the things I've learned, right? From my time over, the last 20 years of my career, and how I think I can help. And I will also tell him like, I talked about regretting going to OneWhy. And here's what's interesting, and this was great advice that I got from Barry, right? And fortuitous the way things turned out, because I talked to him after the offer was made. And I will say I was very surprised at the offer, right, that I received to say, Jake and Barry both kind of came back to me and said, we appreciate your pitch to come in as a director for us, but we really actually like you to come in as a member of our executive team. Because of the things that you were very open and honest with us about your failures, and the fact that you didn't actually feel like a failure anymore, that you felt like those were your learning opportunities, the things that you learned, the things that you would do differently for us, the areas that you would make us watch out for. I was sort of floored, right, by this opportunity. And Jake, of course, is like, hey, look, I've seen what you've done, right? I saw you when you 10 years ago in your career and who you were and kind of your drive and things like that. And I think that we could do great things together. And so, when I was talking to Barry too, again, kind of talking about the mistake of going to OneWhy, because as a side note, OneWhy actually collapsed right there. They had declared bankruptcy 2 weeks after I left, and they no longer exist. But Barry said something that was very eye-opening. He said, had we come after you when you were at the Fed, you may not have come, because you would have been at a very stable old institute and we didn't have a role we were recruiting you for. We just wanted to talk to you about your thoughts on product and maybe to come over as a product manager. And you would have gone from 1,000 enterprise company to a 40-person company. And you probably wouldn't have done it as much as you like Jake, as much as you would have been like, that's great, right? But what you did is you made a decision that you at the time felt like you made a bad decision to leave the Fed to go to OneWhy. So you went from enterprise to a 500-person company. And one of the things I learned there is the part of what led to their destruction, quite frankly, is the things that they didn't do when they were a 40 to 50-person company, as far as process and procedure and doing things the right way. That ended up, when they all of a sudden jumped from 50 to 100 to 200 to 500, those bad habits were there. And you can't unwind those when you're a 500-person company. And that's one of the things I told, RBS, is I was like, I feel like what I bring to the table is the learnings from the things that OneWhy could have done better when they were a smaller company. And quite frankly, right, to kind of be able to take those things and figure out, how do we learn from them? How do we kind of make them better? How do we incorporate those in every day? And really kind of change the mentality, right? And to really say, hey, I get you've got a VP of product now, but that also means, right, we need a product organization. We need to set up client success and client support the right way. We've got to separate them. And here's what's going to happen if you don't, right? Really kind of having that line of sight into it. So it was really just about all of that. And here's the thing, right? I was very open with them too, is that like, you're not just gaining from me, right? I'm gaining too. I don't know anything about cybersecurity. I mean, I know a little bit about it, but not to the extent that they do. But if you look at Risk-Based Security's leadership page and you look at the folks that I'm fortunate enough to be learning from and working with, they're all well decorated in the field. And to be able to learn cybersecurity from them and have kind of that career, you know, like if you can be a leader in the cybersecurity space, you know, you're pretty much set. It's not going anywhere, right? So even if RBS got sold tomorrow, or God forbid something were to happen, you know, it's easy to use that as a springboard into something else, right? The combination of all of these things. And the fact that, you know, I was open and honest with Jake and Barry about the things like the weaknesses that I have, where I need to still focus, where I still need to grow and learn as a person, as a leader, as a professional. And I think all of that, right, really kind of talking about those and saying, you know, Barry asked me a question, he goes, so do you still feel like a failure, right? Based on sort of some of the things you think you've done. And I said, no, because I will say part of the design thinking training that I got, right, was all about changing your definition of failure and really turning into that acronym, that first attempt in learning, right? And that whole kind of failing forward perspective, right? I've got sort of thoughts on, you know, you got to take risks. You got to be open and honest. You've got to constantly be looking at yourself. Like, you will definitely kind of go far, and you will, even if you feel like you didn't use things right away from Carolina, like it actually does come full circle, right? Whether you want to go into UX or product or anything. And honestly, like, I think, right, I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. I don't know that I'm done. But anyway, all of that, right, is to say, and I'll say, like, one of our big icons have said it too, right? Michael Jordan says all the time, right? I've taken hundreds and thousands of shots. I've lost thousands of games, and I'm a success because I've failed. But I think it's because you learn from those failures, right? When you learn from them and really stop and reflect, you'll find that some of those failures become your greatest assets, like later on in life. But anyway, I know I've talked a lot, and I know we're running close on time. Do you guys have any questions? I know I gave you a lot of information.
Yeah, I'm happy to read off any chat questions that come up, or you can unmute yourself if you want to ask something directly. I did have a question for Samira, but I'm going to wait to see if anybody else has a question first. So Samira, I love how you flip the negative narrative of failure into a positive. And I wanted to follow up with that in terms of networking. A lot of times we hear from students who are very accomplished how networking has a very negative connotation, right? It's a little bit, you know, I don't want to bother people. Why would I stick my neck out? They don't need to hear from me, kind of thing. Is there any advice you would share with new professionals I mean, obviously networking has been very important in your background, but also I see that time and time again. What suggestions would you say in terms of how people in your level of career look at new professionals reaching out to network?
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I think it's one that I've asked before, and one that I've certainly been asked before. And I think it comes down to a sense of being genuine, right? So being honest about why you're reaching out, right? Don't ever disguise it and make it what it's not. Be very kind of open in your ask, right? So while folks in the executive level are definitely busy, I will say one of the things that I've learned is they want to help, right? Almost everyone who is in the executive chairs wants to pay it forward. And a lot of us have gotten where we are because of people that have helped us in the past. So I would say, like, don't be afraid to ask, but be very open and clear about your ask from the very start, right? So if it's, hey, I'd love to get together to go to coffee and pick your brain about, right? Or, hey, I'm getting ready to graduate, I'm struggling with something, or, hey, I'm just looking for a job, or, hey, I just got laid off, right? Like, just be very open and honest with your ask in that. And if it truly is like, hey, I want to know more about you or your career path. I looked you up on LinkedIn and I'd love to just, right. I think framing that conversation up is helpful, because know that most people, especially in a networking opportunity, want to prepare for you and not be caught off guard. So if there's something that they can think about or remember or bring for you, they want to be able to bring it to the table. I think that it's rare nowadays to get someone who just is like, oh my God, this is just a suck on my time, right? If they're, anyone who's coming to one of these sessions who says, feel free to reach out to me, right? Like, they truly mean it. I don't think that they would make the offer if they didn't mean it, but they definitely want you to be very clear in your ask. Right. Again, it's okay to just say, hey, I just want to get to know you more as just as a person, not even as a professional, right? To be like, that's kind of cool. Like, oh, or I've had people go like, hey, I didn't know you were from Tanzania. That's really cool. Can we grab a cup of coffee or a drink after work? Right. Absolutely. Right. I made some of my best friends through original networking pitches, but I think that would be the biggest advice is be open and genuine and clear with your ask, because they're getting a lot, and be patient, right? If you don't hear back right away, don't feel like you've bothered them. Know that they saw it, they heard it, they're going to get back to you. And if you haven't heard back in a week, it's okay to follow up, right? Because chances are if you're writing to their email box rather than their LinkedIn, it's getting lost in the midst of a lot of other stuff. So be clear and be patient. Know that they want to get back to you.
Well, Samira, thank you again so much for being part of this new initiative. This is exactly what we were looking for. So I really appreciate you taking the time today.